It was as if a curtain of snow descended before his eyes, accompanied by the cold flash of a sword and the sudden sound of it being drawn. The sword's light reflected off the sky, startling everyone. Wei Wuxian's eyes widened in terror. As the sword light descended before him, he shut his eyes tightly and curled into a ball, his mind consumed by a single thought. In his fury, little old-fashioned was going to kill him. The sword light slashed down, then seamlessly returned to its sheath. The ropes binding Wei Wuxian fell apart. Still scared, he cautiously opened a sliver of his eyes. In his barely open vision, Lan Wangji suddenly leaned towards him. He saw Lan Wangji half kneeling on the ground, reaching out to remove the broken ropes that hung haphazardly on him. Wei Wuxian blinked, staring blankly. A gentle pressure patted his head, brushing off a few dry leaves, picking away a half-loose grass stem, and smoothing out a stray strand of his hair. A touch of softness pressed against his cheek, wiping away the dirt on his face. While Lan Wangji was performing these actions, he remained expressionless, yet his movements were meticulous and gentle. Like a dusty vase, Wei Wuxian was being carefully dusted off, slightly trembling at the touch. His gaze wandered over Lan Wangji's half-lowered eyelids, the seemingly indifferent, light-colored eyes, and the incredibly handsome face. When everything was done, Lan Wangji stood up and extended a hand to him. On his seemingly calm and flawless face, there was a hint of anticipation and nervousness. Little old-fashioned, the inner hesitation and struggle he once felt seemed to have been completely dusted away by those actions. The choice before him was clear and logical. Wei Wuxian could only be momentarily dazed before he lifted his arm and grasped that hand. Lan Wangji pulled him up from the ground, turned around, and just like that, led him step by step towards the hall. Following behind, Wei Wuxian watched his faintly visible profile. He could hear his own boots tapping against the red carpet, the sound slightly hesitant yet, for some reason growing more and more resolute with each step. Crossing the threshold of the hall, Wei Wuxian's gaze finally moved away from Lan Wangji. He looked around at everything surrounding them, feeling somewhat at a loss, yet curious. After a moment, someone shouted, "It's done! It's done again." As if stunned by the silent interaction between the two of them, the elders of the Lan family, who had only now started to react, exchanged complex glances and whispered among themselves. With traces of hesitation on their faces, one by one, they all looked towards Lan Qiren. Lan Qiren remained silent for a moment, then took the lead and started walking. Only then did the crowd move through the layers of arrangements, slowly entering. The guests, as if released from a binding spell, spat out the half-eaten melon seeds from their mouths and surged forward with excitement. The onlookers at the back were confused. What? They're getting married again? Why? Not running away this time? Does the Lan family still recognize this bride? No idea. Let's hurry and see. At the entrance of the hall, people jostled and crowded together like a human pyramid, all eager to sneak a peek inside. The matchmaker came running over in high spirits, almost unable to believe the sudden fortunate turn of events. Seeing the newlyweds both beaming with joy, she rubbed her hands together in delight. After being whispered a few words of reminder, her expression turned anxious, as if afraid that there might still be some variables. She quickly composed herself and began to recite the wedding speech. For the first time in her life, she found the wedding speech to be overly verbose. She was terribly worried that in the intervals of her words, this unpredictable bride with so many mischievous thoughts might once again change his mind. She hurriedly sped up her speech, gesturing here and there, urging the surrounding ceremonial attendants to follow suit, wishing she could just directly press their two heads down to complete the ceremony. All around, voices of doubt and astonishment surged like waves, but Wei Wuxian had no mind to listen. Lan Wangji still held his hand firmly. At this moment, he turned his head, his gentle and serene eyes holding a determined gaze as he looked at Wei Wuxian. In response, Wei Wuxian gently squeezed his hand. The long-winded wedding speech finally came to an end. The matchmaker's face was creased with a wide smile as she drew out her voice and called out, Bow! The prolonged gaze between the two was suddenly interrupted, and they both knelt down. After the 3 bows, 2 cups of celebratory tea were placed into the hands of Lan Wangji and Wei Wuxian. Wei Wuxian, who hadn't been paying attention earlier, now noticed that there was only one person seated in the place of honor before them. Lan Wangji's mother, Madame Qingheng, had long passed away. Wei Wuxian had heard of this before. So, the person seated there, his gaze swept over to an elegant middle-aged man whose features bore a striking resemblance to Lan Wangji, especially in the aloof and noble air around his eyes and brows. However, within this detached demeanor there lingered an unmistakable sorrow and an air of solitude that could not be hidden. The gaze directed at Lan Wangji held a deep and inextinguishable affection. Wei Wuxian immediately understood. This was Lan Wangji's father, the head of the Lan family, Qingheng Jun. On the empty seat, there was a set of indigo clothing, meticulously folded, with a gentian flower quietly lying on top of it. On the tea table between the 2 chairs, there was an unremarkable dark-colored small box, which Qingheng Jun was gently stroking with his hand. Following the matchmaker's signal, Wei Wuxian extended the cup of tea towards Qingheng Jun. For some reason, Qingheng Jun's actions paused, and he delayed in taking the cup of tea. The matchmaker felt a bit awkward and lightly cleared her throat. Qingheng Jun still did not move. Around them, there were some slight fidgeting and hushed exchanges. Wei Wuxian felt at a loss and nervously wondered if Qingheng Jun did not agree to this marriage. Or perhaps, because of the fiasco with Wei Wuxian running away from marriage, there was some lingering resentment, and he was unwilling for Wei Wuxian to marry into the Lan family? He exchanged a glance with Lan Wangji, who gave him a slight nod, and then called out softly, "Father?" Qingheng Jun seemed to come back to his senses and took the cup of tea from Wei Wuxian's hands. Everyone's hearts, which had been in their throats, finally settled back into place. Just a moment ago, Qingheng Jun had been sizing up Wei Wuxian repeatedly. Though he had been sitting quietly in the hall throughout the day's commotion, he hadn't actively inquired, but had grasped the gist from the fragmented words around him. When Lan Wangji led this young man into the hall, only then did the young man's gaze, which had been fixed on Lan Wangji, slightly shift away. A pair of lively black eyes, like a startled deer, yet slightly bewildered, knelt in front of him. The young man's face still bore smudges that hadn't been wiped clean. His crumpled ceremonial attire showed imprints from being tied with hemp rope, clear signs of a recent struggle. Qingheng Jun's thoughts suddenly came to a halt. Back then, she was also like this, bound and brought before the elders of the Lan family. Her face was filled with indignant anger, and when she looked at him, there was a subtle, complex emotion. He had untied her bonds, held her hand, and walked into the ceremonial hall together. In a hall filled with cold silence, they bowed to heaven and earth, completing the marriage ceremony. The current situation was eerily similar. The thread of fate, profound and unfathomable, had come full circle, landing on his own son. But it was still different. The child was a good child, despite some minor transgressions. Though the path with Lan Wangji in the future might not be easy, Qingheng Jun gazed into his bright black eyes, discerning an undeniable innocence and a vibrant, spirited aura. He could see why Lan Wangji liked him. He could also see that love clearly reflected in his son's eyes. The cup of tea was quietly placed aside, and Qingheng Jun looked at Lan Wangji. Under the slightly surprised gaze of everyone, he slowly spoke. "Wangji, since you have chosen him, you must cherish and protect him." Lan Wangji nodded firmly, just about to respond. Qingheng Jun's somewhat distant gaze focused on the distance. "Above all, do not follow in your father's footsteps. Do not repeat our mistakes." Lan Wangji was slightly taken aback, unsure of how to respond. Qingheng Jun gave him a faint smile, a smile that seemed to hide many complex thoughts. Without waiting for these emotions to settle, he turned to Wei Wuxian and said, "Live well with Wangji." Wei Wuxian replied with a firm and flashed a bright smile. Qingheng Jun nodded in satisfaction and brought the teacup to his lips.